Hello and welcome to The Sharpening. I am your host, Josh Peck. Tonight we have a special guest who I had the pleasure of meeting in person at the conference, the Prophecy Forum, held in Ohio last November. We had a chance to talk a few times, found out we had quite a bit in common, and thankfully he agreed to be on the show. Cris Putnam is a best-selling author and Christian apologist. He holds a master's in theological studies, a certification in Christian apologetics, and a BS in religion and mathematics. He has been interviewed on Prophecy in the News numerous times, as well as the television show Countdown to Apocalypse on the History Channel. He has appeared on major radio shows and podcasts across the country. Cris is the co-author of Petrus Romanus, Exo-Vaticana, and On the Path of the Immortals, alongside Tom Horn, which will be the topic of tonight's show. So all that being said, it is my honor to welcome Cris Putnam to the show. Cris, how are you doing?
Hey, Josh, it's great to be on the Sharpening with you. And you mentioned that we met in person at the Prophecy Forum conference in Dublin, Ohio, last was it November? I guess it was, and that was kind of fun. And just to let your listeners know, if you're interested in that, at my website logosapologia.org right now, I have the lecture that I gave at that conference. It's called Astrobiology, the Vatican, and the Coming World Religion. And that was one of the talks I gave at that conference. And it's the whole video of that whole talk is available right now at logosapologia.org.
Oh, great. Yeah. Yeah, that's awesome. I didn't have a chance to catch it at the actual conference. I was at my own table, but I had a chance to check it out later on at the Prophecy Forum website, and it's an excellent presentation. So yeah, anyone who's interested should definitely check that out. So I can't imagine there's really too many people that aren't, but for those who may not be familiar with you, would you be able to give us a rundown of your testimony, how you came to know Jesus, and how that led to what you do today?
Well, Josh, I did not really grow up as a believer, and I was pretty skeptical myself, and I became a Christian in my 30s, and that was after pursuing a lifestyle of excess mainly. I was kind of into playing electric guitar and playing in rock bands and kind of pursuing that whole line, and that pretty much was a train wreck when it came. And I kind of came to the end of myself, and I had always kind of been into weird stuff, and I had somewhat of a scientific background, and I really got a calling from the Lord to kind of venture into areas that most theologians and apologists don't want to talk about. And so I traffic in a lot of these strange ideas like UFOs and the Nephilim and paranormal stuff. But from what my study, the Bible is full of weird stuff. It's a weird book, and it's full of weird supernatural stuff. And, we really should be talking about that kind of stuff, especially in light of our culture's fascination with it. And that's what my book, The Supernatural Worldview, really addresses, is that, we're kind of in the midst of what I call a paranormal paradigm shift in the Western culture now, where people are increasingly embracing all kinds of strange occultic and paranormal beliefs, yet rejecting classical theism and biblical Christianity at the same time. So they're really open to this kind of Eastern oneism type spirituality, and so that's what that book's about. But so my calling really, it's kind of explained in that book, but it really it came later in life, and it really was something that I felt that God put me kind of on a mission to do what I'm doing now, and it seems to be working out. So I think that was a good interpretation of that call.
Yeah, definitely. I can relate a lot to that too. I actually grew up as a believer, but kind of fell away from it in my teenage years and early 20s especially. And like you, I played electric guitar in a few rock bands and stuff, so that's pretty cool. But yeah, I got the same calling. I was always into weird stuff too, and I won't go into my whole testimony. This is just us talking, but everybody who's listened to the show already knows all that. But it's nice to be able to have guests on where I can relate to their personal testimony, and I think a lot of the audience relates to that too, which is why that's always the first question I ask any new guest. So you've written a number of books with Tom Horn. How did you two meet and decide to work together? This will be what your third book written with him?
Yeah, if you don't count the compilations, but yeah, it's kind of the third, and I guess it's sort of turning into a trilogy of sorts. But the first thing, in pursuit of that calling, I went to seminary to get this master's degree in theological studies, and during that time, I would gear my research papers for classes, to these sorts of topics, because I sort of had a clear idea of the direction I was heading. So I wrote a paper critiquing the idea of Christian transhumanism for a systematic theology class, and about the same time, I think it was probably around 2009, maybe something like that, 8. Tom Horn had published a open letter to Christian leaders, to get involved in the conversation about genetic enhancement, transhumanism, before it's too late, basically. And so, I saw that letter at his Raiders news site, and I sent him that paper, and Tom read it, and he ended up wanting to publish it, and so that paper ended up as a chapter in the book Pandemonium's Engine, which was a compilation of chapters by people like Chuck Missler, Tom, Gary Stearman, a whole bunch of different authors contributed chapters to that book. I think Derek Gilbert and Sharon Gilbert did something in that. It's kind of like the book that's out now, Blood on the Altar, about Christian persecution. I have a chapter in that book. And that was actually a seminary paper. Started out, too. It was a paper on same-sex marriage. And, that's the issue that is being used to marginalize Christians in the United States right now, this issue of homosexuality. So that paper really is addressing that from that angle. It's not that, that's such a special issue to me. It's just that that's the one the culture has chosen to level against us as a weapon. And, they're using it to basically fine people out of business. And, in Sweden right now, pastors being threatened with jail time for preaching against homosexuality. So, that was their choice, and that is the hot button issue now. So that's what my chapter in that book's about. So that's how me and Tom hooked up. And then, of course, we kind of started talking about this prophecy of the popes thing, and when right around 2012, when it really looked like, that it was, the last next to the last pope on the list, and we were expecting something to happen with Benedict. So Tom and I started talking about that via email, and that kind of turned into the book Petrus Romanus, which became a huge success, and we were, fortunate in that, some of the speculations we made in that book came to pass in really remarkable ways. We predicted that Pope Benedict would step down, and it happened pretty much the way we said it would, and that really captured a lot of people's attention. And so the next book, Exo-Vaticana, really dealt with the connection between the Vatican and the alien question, the extraterrestrial question, and as well as a lot of general UFO-type information about the interdimensional hypothesis and all sorts of stuff like that, and a lot of the history, and even some of the theology that the Church has been developing. I tackled a lot of that. Both of those books were rather large. The new one, On the Path of the Immortals, that we're talking about today, it's still a big book, but compared to those, it's not quite as big. And that was by design. I mean, the other books were just absolutely huge, and we decided to not to be quite as ambitious this time. So there might have been. It might be 2 or 3 chapters short of the first 2, but the first 2 are like encyclopedias.
Yeah, absolutely. For somebody like me, that's a blessing. I mean, it's almost like a collection of books because you cover so many topics, and I got a lot out of both of them, Petrus Romanus and Exo-Vaticana. So yeah, that brings us to On the Path of the Immortals. You guys have covered so much ground in Petrus Romanus and Exo-Vaticana. What led to On the Path of the Immortals?
Well, a lot of people who read Exo-Vaticana, were wondering, what's the follow-up, and right now, I think it's important maybe just to mention this, is that there's a little buzz on the internet going right now that Pope Francis is going to announce some kind of contact with a higher intelligence extraterrestrial on June 15th, 2015. Now, this is coming from attorney Daniel Sheehan, who is a rather famous attorney in the United States. He's tried some really high-profile cases, and he at one time he was the head counsel for the Jesuit order in the United States. Now, he's not a Roman Catholic, he's not a Jesuit, but he was their attorney. He was their representative for a number of years. So he does have some contacts within the Jesuit order at minimum, and he might be privy to something. He claims that he is. Now, this was at a UFO conference. And it was the Contact in the Desert was the name of the conference. You can look this up on the internet. Daniel Sheehan, in his talk, he implied that the Pope was going to make some kind of announcement, I guess, next week, June 15th, and which happens to be my birthday. I found that a little interesting.
Oh, wow.
I don't know if anything. Yeah, I don't know if anything's going to come of that. Sheehan, I've vetted him in the past because he's made some other statements similar to that. When I wrote Exo-Vaticana, in fact, I quote him in that book, saying some similar sorts of things about an announcement that'll be coming up, but he never really put a time on it before. So this time he's being real specific, like he knows something, and he only gave himself a few weeks when he said it. So I have to think that he must really believe it, or because he's setting himself up to look like a fool next week if nothing happens. I don't know. I suspect it might not be as huge as it sounds right now. Pope Francis, made a comment last year that he would baptize as extraterrestrial, kind of tongue-in-cheek, but of course, Guy Consul Magno has been going around lecturing on baptizing ETs and all this stuff. The Vord astronomer, the guy with the big fuzzy beard that you see on a lot of the articles, he's been, on a tour on that topic, and so Pope Francis seems very sympathetic to the existence of these beings. He seems to think that it's inevitable that we will discover them because there's so many planets, blah, blah, blah. The same argument the naturalists use, it would be a terrible waste of space, like from the movie Contact. And, my reply to that is always, to a being that's omnipotent and omniscient, and omnipresent, the concept of wasted space is incoherent.
Right.
For God, there is no wasted space. I mean, he could make a whole other universe. So, the fact that, there's all these empty planets, why would God do that? I don't know, but, it's not wasted in his mind. It's trivial in his mind. He's all those omnis, So I don't even think the concept of waste can apply to God in the same sense that we apply it to humans. Because when you think about wasting something, that implies your resources are limited.
Right.
God's resources he doesn't have limited resources. He has everything, and he doesn't need anything. So the concept of wasted space, how does that apply to an omnipotent creator? I don't think it does. So, that argument just kind of falls flat because it's very anthropocentric. It's coming from a human perspective, not really from a divine perspective, which is really what you're talking about when you're talking about the creation of all these planets. So it just kind of fails on that level for me. And this is the sort of thing that Pope Francis and the Jesuits are out there saying, that because there's so many exoplanets now, they just think it's inevitable. It's a matter of when, rather than if, they will discover life. So he could just, publish an encyclical saying that it's acceptable for Catholics to believe in ET, blah, 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 and maybe that's what will come out on June 15th. I suspect if it's anything, that'll probably be it. But, of course, the buzz going around right now is that he's going to, drag ET out on stage or something, but I don't anticipate that actually happening. But if it did, maybe it would be the great deception that, many of us have been talking about. It's possible that it's that. I'm always skeptical. But On the Path of the Immortals is kind of born out of that book and those ideas, in that we think that it's possible something like that could happen, but we don't really believe it's a extraterrestrial being that evolved on some other planet by a naturalistic process. Rather, and the way that I parse this, a lot of Christians say, well, the Bible doesn't say ET exists, therefore ET doesn't exist. I don't find that to be a very good argument against the existence of extraterrestrials. The Bible doesn't mention a lot of things that do exist.
Right.
It doesn't mention microwave ovens. It doesn't mention Volkswagen Beetles. And I'm being a little bit silly there, but the fact that the Bible doesn't mention something is not a proof that it doesn't exist. That's an argument from ignorance, basically.
Right.
You don't argue from what it doesn't say. You argue from what it does say. And here's the way I parse it. The Bible doesn't mention benevolent space brothers coming to help me with my spiritual evolution, which seems to be the message that I'm getting from all these contactees. And other than, some of them are saying that they're bad and they're here to, kill us, or start some hybrid breeding program. So you have all these different opinions, but even the best, version of that is they're here to help us with our spiritual evolution. The Bible never mentions that. It seems like, if I believe biblical prophecy and I believe the words of Jesus, the next big, huge paradigm-shifting, world-changing event that the Bible seems to predict is the return of Christ. It doesn't say anything about E.T. landing on the White House lawn. And so, I think it would. And I think that the fact that it does tell us to look out for an unparalleled level of deception just prior to Jesus' return, it warns us about that. And when I look at what it does say in the prophecies in the Bible, I base my opinion on what it does say. I think that this ET thing has a good chance of matching up with that deception that they're talking about, that apostasy and that great falling away. Maybe that would be inspired by the spiritual, content coming from these benevolent space brothers, in air quotes there. So that, my argument is from what prophecy does tell me. And so I see that, the messages from the contactees and the abductees and the sort of spirituality associated with this stuff, it really seems to fit the mold of the deception that's predicted in Scripture. So based on what the Bible does say, I kind of put it in that category. And and so what are these beings then if something physical shows up? What are these people being touched by who are abducted? What are they seeing? Well, the book On the Path of the Immortals sort of addresses that in a little less direct way than, we're not necessarily saying that ETs are these beings, but it just explains how it could work. The Bible does mention that God created a whole host of other beings other than humans between us and Him. These are typically labeled angels. I don't like that word because it's really a job description of a certain type of being rather than a type of being. We've turned a job description into an ontology, basically, and it's not an ontology. Angelos in Greek means messenger, and so that word appears throughout the New Testament. It could be a human or a supernatural being, but typically these are, they look like humans. When Gabriel appeared to Daniel, he was a shining, bright, human, and he talked to him like a man. The guys that show up at the tomb when Jesus has resurrected, he's not here. These shining men. These are the angels. These are the messengers. They bring messages from God to man, the angel of the Lord, and in the Old Testament in some places. So these are the angels. But then we see these other beings, the seraphim, which show up in the throne room imagery in Isaiah, are six-winged, plumed. They're basically flying reptiles. They're serpents of some sort. It's really interesting. In the throne room imagery in Isaiah, they just transliterate the Hebrew term seraphim. They write seraphim. They don't translate it into English. But later in Isaiah, in a different context, the same exact Hebrew term, seraphim, is translated into English to be fiery flying serpents. But they're the same beings. Okay, and I think the difference is in one context they're fallen. Okay, and when they're fallen, they're fiery flying serpents. But when they're holy, they're just called seraphim. I think it's really a case of Bible translators kind of censoring the Bible for the reader because they're afraid that believers might be somehow, turned off by the idea that there's serpentine beings flying around the throne of God. But it's certainly what the descriptions describe. There's really no debate as to the Hebrew, the meaning that it is a serpentine type being. So we see these, 6-winged serpent beings flying around the throne room of God, and then later in a fallen context as fiery flying serpents. Now, these, if somebody were to see one of these today, without a biblical framework or anything, they would probably think it was an extraterrestrial of some sort. I would assume, and also trace these beings throughout Mesoamerica, where you have all kinds of Indian tribes, the Incas, the Aztecs, and the Mayans, all worshiping plumed serpent deities. Basically the same sort of serpentine, winged, flying supernatural beings as their gods, like Quetzalcoatl. So it's fascinating to me that we see something so clearly similar being worshipped as a deity, by these indigenous tribes. And of course, we know that a lot of the angels fell, and some of the Psalms tell us that they portrayed themselves as gods to the other nations. And so I think that's what's going on in Mesoamerica. And I suspect that what we see going on with this ET reality that people are talking about is something similar, some sort of created being between God and man that's perhaps fallen, and they are portraying themselves to be ETs. Now, I don't. A lot of people will say, well, they're demons. There's another term that I don't like. It's not very precise. It's not very clear what you're talking about. Are they angels? Are they demons? It's very confusing. Again, demon is a term that could mean a whole lot of different things as well if you look at the Greek. So this is where the idea of the immortals comes from. Angel, because angelos means messenger, it doesn't really describe the seraphim. It doesn't describe the cherubim, another type of being. And, we don't even know that there might be a whole host of other things that God hasn't even told us about. Nowhere did he promise that he told us about everything he ever made. So there could be a lot more strange creatures. The Bible does talk about satyrs and all kinds of things like that in the prophecies. It talks about weird monstrosities flying out during the fifth trumpet judgment in the book of Revelation that have scorpion tails and hair like women, and all kinds of. They sound like some sort of hybrid genetic mutants or something with scorpion tails. But apparently God created these things as well. Or maybe fallen angels created them. I don't know. But there's all kinds of weird beings in the Bible that the term angel just doesn't cover. But in Psalm, I think it's Psalm 145, it talks about God's work of creation. It talks about he created the Sabah and the Malak. And the Sabah it's a Hebrew word for hosts, is the way it's usually translated in English. That's a military term. And so it's really talking about God created, he has a divine army. And no telling what those beings all look like. But then it says the Malak, which are the messengers, which are, typically the word angel would go there. But he says he created them to live forever. Okay? So although they're created, they don't die. So this is where the term immortal comes from. So because angel is so imprecise, demon is really imprecise and confusing to a lot of people. The term immortals kind of covers it all and is more accurate as to what they actually are. They weren't designed to die. They do have a beginning in time. They're not eternal. They haven't always existed, but they do have a definite endpoint. So they have a definite beginning point, but not an end point. Some of them will have an end point because God has said, you will die like men in one of the Psalms to the ones that fell and disobeyed him. So I suspect some of them are in for a surprise. But anyway, that was a lot to get around to the point of why we call it On the Path of the Immortals and how that does connect to the ET question somewhat, and that I suspect the physical beings people call ETs are probably one and the same as these immortals.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree, and it's definitely a lot of interesting topics in that, and one thing I wanted to ask you guys did a lot of traveling and expeditions and things like that. One thing that I found really interesting was what you found around Sedona and at a Bradshaw Ranch even. Would you be able to tell us about some of the things that you found out there, and even some of the things that you guys saw?
Sure. Well, that's one thing that makes a book interesting. People kind of like to go on an adventure, and we wanted to, in exo-vaticana, we went up to Mount Graham and visited the Vatican Observatory up there and the Large Binocular Telescope. What we found out when we got down from that mountain was that the Indians were really upset about it because they view that mountain as a portal, as, an entry point to the sacred. And perhaps that explains why the Vatican and the University of Arizona went through so much trouble to get up on that mountain. They actually did an end run around all the environmental regulations. Well, so we got interested in this idea of portals, places where the veil is thinner between this realm and the next realm. The scientific way of talking about it would be a parallel universe. There's an astronomer at Harvard, Owen Greenwich, and he famously said, he was talking basically to skeptics and atheists. He said, they don't have any problem at all believing in parallel universes and all this. Well, if you can believe in parallel universes, you really shouldn't have a big problem with things like heaven and hell. and that's kind of what we're getting at, is in Scripture we do see this idea of doorways to other realms over and over again. We see the gates of heaven, the gates of hell. Jesus mentions the gates of hell will not, prevail against the church. But the gates of heaven, it's mentioned all throughout the Old Testament, New Testament. But the gates, to Sheol, gates to death. But this term gates, it appears over and over again. And it's the same idea that we're talking about. It's some sort of entry point to another realm, a different mode of reality, like heaven. The Bible does seem to talk about the second heaven, the third heaven. And there was a belief, back in the first century that there were 7 heavens. The Bible doesn't necessarily endorse that, but it was a popular notion. So the idea that there are other realms is not that terribly controversial from a biblical theology point of view. The idea that there are entry points shouldn't be that controversial either. I mean, that's kind of the whole idea of sacred mountains, Mount Sinai, Mount Horeb, Mount Hermon in the Book of Enoch. I don't think that there's anything magic about being a certain elevation. It's that there is a place, and it's kind of far away or removed from the rest of the world, but this is a place where, it's facilitated to enter between these realms, to enter and exit. And, the Bible supports that notion. I do believe in Babylon's another place. The Tower of Babel would be another place where they tried to do that. And God seemed to take it seriously enough that he thwarted it. He went through a lot of trouble to confuse the languages of the people so they wouldn't do what they were trying to do. Because he said, if I'll let them do this, anything they want to do, they'll be able to accomplish. That seems to be a rather astounding statement for Yahweh to make, considering the work of men. If I let them do this, anything they wish to do, they will accomplish. I mean, I still really can't wrap my head around what God's talking about exactly with that. But I think the idea is that they were trying to build a portal to the heavens, and that's what they said it was, and that's what it means. And so we wanted to look into that idea. When I started researching this idea of portals and dimensional doors, and over and over again, the Sedona, Arizona area kept coming up. It's also really popular in the UFO literature. There's just been a lot of UFO sightings there, and I can tell you why now, because we saw one while we were there and got a picture of it.
Oh, wow.
So yeah, there's a ranch named the Bradshaw Ranch that you mentioned in the question, and it was named after this Hollywood stuntman Bob Bradshaw, who actually owned a working cattle ranch out there. But during the 90s, his wife, at the time Linda Bradshaw, started photographing all kinds of orbs and strange beings and Bigfoot footprints and all kinds of weird stuff. And so they came up with this hypothesis that it is a dimensional doorway there. This idea has been developed through a couple books. Merging Dimensions by Linda Bradshaw and Tom Dongo is probably the first one that came out. I read that book, and then I read some of the articles in UFO journals and whatnot, people who had visited that area, and It's just really common for almost everyone who goes to that area to see something weird. And I can say that we did. We definitely photographed a whole bunch of what people call orbs. Now, I wasn't really an orb believer at all when I went on this trip. I always thought that I'd taken some parapsychology classes, and a lot of the photos, are debunked as dust particles or light reflections inside the camera, what they call lens flare. But to eliminate that, I took a professional photographer with me, and we took some really high quality Canon camera equipment and set up two cameras at different angles. So if we got orbs on one camera, the only way to verify that it wasn't a camera anomaly is to see if it appeared on both at the same time. So we had one running video, one running still shots, and not only did we catch them on both cameras, the photographer actually saw an orb with his naked eye.
Oh, wow.
Now, this area is famous. It's famous for these orbs. And these books that I read, we're talking about these orbs everywhere. I've talked to a lot of other people since I've gotten back who have heard me talking about this, who have emailed me and contacted me on Facebook, who have also seen them in the Sedona area. Now, I mentioned the UFO. If you go to my Facebook page, you'll see this photograph of me with the stars up in the sky in the background. The way you take that photo, we went out to the desert in Sedona at night, and the photographer opened up the lens of the camera for like 10 seconds, and I had to stand perfectly still. So it's a real photo, but the stars are really bright because he held it open for so long, it gathers a lot more light from the stars. So that. But while me and him were doing that, my wife was walking around the desert just behind us, just taking shots. I guess she was trying to see if she could catch some more of those orbs. And while she was doing that, she captured a large triangular UFO way up in the sky by accident and didn't even see it at the time. We didn't discover this UFO till we got home and we were reviewing the photos. I was looking through them and I go, honey, you took a photograph of a UFO. And it's at my website, supernaturalworldview.com. I got the photo posted. Just look up triangle UFO or whatever, and we got close-ups of it pulled in, and I've had several people look at it. To me, it really does look like a really large triangle craft in the distance, and it's really pointy triangular. It doesn't look like your typical airplane type triangle. It's like a really pointy triangle. It's really strange looking, and the close-ups, the light sources on it are really kind of bizarre, the way they show up. But that's available at the supernaturalworldview.com to have that photo posted. And it's also in the book, but it shows up a lot clearer on the internet if you want to look at it at the website there. But so she caught that by complete accident. At the same time, we caught all these orbs flying around. I have a video of one of the fast-moving orbs on the Path of the Immortals Facebook page. I uploaded some video clips of the orbs moving around. Now, like I said, I've had this orb thing confirmed by lots of different people since then, and I've also just uncovered some information yesterday, which is brand new, and I haven't told anybody about this. I don't even know if Tom Horn knows this yet, so this will be a first for you and your listeners. Is that
awesome.
The whole Bradshaw Ranch area is strange because the U.S. Forestry Service bought that land and basically kind of forced themselves into taking it, and they put a fence around it. And this has created all this conspiracy lore. They ostensibly are buying this to make it a national park, to make it open for the public. Yet the first thing they do is they put a huge fence around it and say no trespassing. An area that is legendary for paranormal activity, and the government buys it and closes it off. What are they doing? Well, they're not going to open it up for public access. I know that for a fact right now. In fact, what it turns out to be is that they are claiming they're going to turn this into a climate change experiment. It's really dubious. It just sounds like an excuse to close it off. I'm trying to find the documents right now. I'm looking at my history of my browser. But they literally are calling it a climate change laboratory.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and so they're going to have all these scientists living on the Bradshaw Ranch, and supposedly they're going to be growing crops or something to see how they're affected by climate change. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense what they're claiming they're going to be doing. And, the whole climate change thing is kind of dubious anyway to me.
Yeah.
But the fact that they bought this area that's famous for paranormal activity, and now they're going to put a whole bunch of government scientists on it. They're going to close it off to the public so they can do experiments on climate change. It just doesn't really make a lot of sense. So they're up to something, but I suspect the climate change thing is a red herring, a cover story for what they're really investigating. And from what I can tell, there really is some kind of dimensional door or some sort of portal, some sort of entry point where these orbs and all kinds of strange phenomena are coming through at the Bradshaw Ranch in the desert right outside of Sedona, Arizona. So, that's just a brief encapsulation of what happened. There's a lot more going on in Sedona than that. There's just a whole New Age community of psychics and Eastern meditators and the whole gamut. There's all these vortex areas that are famous there, the red rock formations. People use these to meditate on, and all kinds of Eastern spiritual practices and things of that nature. What I found even more kind of astounding is that the Catholic Church established their presence there in the 1950s. About a couple decades before the New Age movement ensued, they built the Chapel at the Holy Cross, which is now considered one of the vortex areas. And the whole concept of a vortex I found really fascinating. We dealt with that in the book as well. Perhaps we could talk about that some too.
Yeah, absolutely. That actually leads to my my next question. What do you think about modern technology and the search of or even creation of portals such as there's claims about the LHC at CERN, and then how does that also connect with the New Age movement? Because a lot of times these psychics or people with other titles has to do with that will claim that they can open portals just through meditation or through anything else. So are what the psychics are doing and modern technology, are they opening the same kinds of portals, or how do those connect? How does that connect with modern technology?
That's a good question, Josh, and that's one that I'm not fully sure of the answer. I suspect that on the surface they seem to be different kinds of portals that we're talking about. So CERN, you asked about, just to kind of hit that. What are they doing at CERN? Well, they're doing particle physics, so they're dealing with really, really small stuff that nobody can even see. That's the number one thing to keep in mind. It's a huge particle collider, but what they're actually looking at is so small that nobody can see it. But their director of research, Sergio Bertolucci, when the thing went online, he went out in the media and made comments about we could open a door and something could come through, or we could send something through. And he was kind of vague, and I think he was intentionally trying to be provocative. I think he's trying to promote the facility and perhaps spark some controversy. But when he said that, of course, that it created a huge outcry on the internet that they were going to open a portal and the aliens are going to come through or whatever. But this is the sort of stuff that they're saying.
Yeah.
And then they dedicate the facility to the Hindu god Shiva, who is basically the Hindu destroyer god in the cyclical notion. So they had this notion that creation in time is cyclical. It basically there's a creation and it gets destroyed and then it cycles again, and it happens endlessly, eternally, cycles of creation and destruction. And Shiva is both creator and destroyer. It just depends on which end of the cycle you're looking at. But as a Christian, as an apologist, as a theologian, as someone who's studied demonology, I look at Hinduism and I see that they have 30 million gods, okay, little g gods, and that many of these gods are just overtly evil, I would say. And I would think that most of these gods there is some kind of real reality behind them, but it's what, classically we would label a demon or a fallen angel. One of these immortals who has, represented themselves as a god. And, the fact that there's so many of them, in Hinduism, I suspect that, that they could have more than one identity, that some of these entities probably portray themselves as 2 or 3 different characters, or maybe even more. Who knows? I have no idea. But I don't know. Out of 30 million of them, I don't think they're all necessarily one entity. Is what I'm getting at. Some of them might not even exist at all. But I think that these fallen angels, these demons, the fallen immortals, are opportunists. So when someone starts praying to some non-existent idol, they're more than happy to take that role.
Right.
And fulfill that being for you and be that being for you. And they do that all the time. And, Paul talks about that in one of his letters to the Corinthians. He says, it's not that these idols have anything in and of themselves, but, the things that the pagans offer, they offer them to demons, and I don't want you to be participants with demons. This is what Paul's telling the church in Corinth. Don't take part in these rituals that the pagans are doing, because they're offering them to idols, and these idols have a demonic reality behind them. So that's definitely an idea that's in accord with New Testament theology, that these idols definitely could have a demonic power that makes them come to life. So, I don't see any problem with saying that CERN has dedicated their facility to a demon, and they really have. And they go out and they start saying that they might open up a portal and something might come through. I don't know that they will or not, but, Tom Horn is convinced that the whole thing is a huge Stargate, and there's a chapter in our book that says that. Now, that's his chapter, and I'll let him defend it. I think that there's very likely something to it, but I don't know. I do respect the field of particle physics and the work that they're doing there, trying to figure out how physical reality seems to work, and I think that's important work that they're doing. I don't want to just demonize all the scientists there, but at the same time, they have to realize that they named their facility, they dedicated it to Shiva, and it's hard for us to ignore that sort of thing, even though they don't believe in it. They're falling right into it, the mold of what we would expect. So, that's how I feel about CERN. Now, the rest of the question, I forgot what you asked me a lot. What was it? Where did I go after CERN?
It's kind of funny too, because I had something that I wanted to add to that, but I might have to hold off till we finish this question first. But I asked how it relates to the New Age movement, because a lot of psychics, practitioners of New Age will say that they can open portals too. So how
I think they do. And I think it's a different sort of thing. I mean, the kind of things that the scientists are talking about, they're talking about something that they can quantify, that they can observe, and, something that has a physical quantification, something that they can put numbers on and do equations with. How that plays into something like consciousness is a different matter. Now, it does play into it. We know that consciousness affects physical matter. We know things from just the phenomenon of the observer in physics, is it a photon? Is the photon a particle, or is it a wave? Well, is anybody looking? So the observer matters. Consciousness does affect physical reality, and that's, I know, something that you're fascinated with as well.
Yeah.
So what the New Agers are doing through meditation and the techniques that that they use, sometimes psychedelic drugs like ayahuasca or DMT, and I covered that in the book as well. There's a chapter on occult portals, and I read Rick Strassman, the author of DMT, the Spirit Molecule. I read his book. I've studied quite a bit of Graham Hancock's literature, and he did some DMT himself, and read a book called Supernatural, and where he describes his experiments and his experiences. And he draws a lot of interesting parallels between the ETs and things like fairies and the lore of the UK from a couple hundred years ago. Basically the same story with a technological gloss on it today. You know, the same story that they were saying about fairies in the UK 200 years ago is what we talk about with alien abduction today. We just kind of updated the language. And I think that's a really good point. Jacques Vallée was probably the first one who made that, but Graham Hancock develops it quite a bit in his book Supernatural. So I read all that stuff, and I think that they are opening portals. I don't know that it's the same as tearing the space-time continuum with a piece of a cork that they're doing at CERN, but there's something going on in that you can open yourself up to this other realm, and you can travel to that other realm by using either drugs or techniques like meditation, even things like binaural beats, just brain entrainment is what they call it, where you can sort of get your brain on a certain delta frequency. These sorts of things tend to work. There's a book by a scholar named Hume. I think her name's Lynn Hume, and the book is called Portals. And she really deals with shamanism and all these different cultures and shows how they use things like rhythmic dancing, spinning around in circles, all kinds of, the whirling dervishes. All these things are a means of getting into an altered state of consciousness. Now, these altered states seem to be a portal. They seem to be a way to access these other realms. Now, I don't think that's the same as a full-on physical access that might occur if someone were to travel through a physical portal, but I think your consciousness does travel to these other realms. I think that perhaps that explains some of the things that we observe in dreams. I think that maybe that's the way it works. So, all that, it's all very mysterious, but yeah, they're doing some of the same thing, but not necessarily the same thing. And that's kind of where I'd have to leave it. I don't, the intersection between physical reality and consciousness is one of the biggest mysteries of all time, and I don't have an authoritative answer for you on that. But what the New Agers are talking about, I talk about this idea of a vortex. And a vortex is just a spiral. It's a spinning thing like a tornado. It's like water going down a drain. These are all vortex funnels. So it's interesting to me that in the early 80s in Sedona, this psychic medium, her name was Paige Bryant, she was channeling an entity called Albion, who I would just straight up label a demon. And Albion is really an old name. It's probably one of the oldest names for the island of Great Britain. It means something like white, and I think it's kind of related to the White Cliffs of Dover or something like that. But Albion was an entity that she channeled, and he told her to mention these vortex areas around the city of Sedona. They're these big red rock formations. They're really beautiful. It's a great place to visit, whether you believe this stuff or not. It's beautiful. But one of them is Bell Rock, for instance, and Bell Rock is just a huge, bell-shaped red rock formation. Now, in the 1980s, all these New Agers were under the leadership of a guy named Jose Alaguirares, I think was his name. He is famous for popularizing this thing called the harmonic convergence that happened in 1987. And this was a worldwide meditation event where, they were basically trying to open a portal by meditating and bringing in, the new age. And that was their goal. They thought that it would be facilitated by the return of, the Mayan Quetzalcoatl and a lot of UFOs and whatnot. And in fact, in Sedona, thousands of people gathered around Bell Rock expecting a mothership to emerge out of the rock in 87. And, of course, that didn't happen. All kinds of explanations and excuses were probably offered, but you know how that always goes.
Oh, yeah.
Well, it was there. You just couldn't see it. It was invisible, that kind of thing. But, then we had the same thing happen again in 2012. All the New Agers were saying, we were going to ascend, and this whole Age of Enlightenment was going to happen, and all this cosmic stuff was going to happen down there in the Mayan ruins, and of course nothing really happened. But the same people are still famous. Like, I was looking at that Contact in the Desert, conference that I was just talking about, the Daniel Sheehan, the guy that worked for the Jesuits, was talking about Pope Francis going to announce ETs. He was speaking at that. Well, one of the speakers there is David Wilcock. Now, David Wilcock was like making all kinds of predictions about 2012, and none of them came to pass.
Right.
But nobody holds him accountable, and he's still, speaking at all their conferences. He's still famous. Why don't they say, hey, you were wrong about almost everything you said?
Yeah.
I don't get the lack of accountability. It's like when Harold Camping said the Rapture was going to happen, when that failed, boy, we were all over him.
Yeah.
But they don't seem to police their own very well in the New Age community. You can make all kinds of false predictions, and it doesn't seem like anybody cares.
Wow. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. It's a really strange phenomenon how much they'll let slide, on the other side of the fence. But here, if you say one thing, and the whole
Right.
false rapture prediction was a big deal. But I mean, even in smaller circles, if somebody puts up a post on Facebook or something, let's say saying that though this comet's going to hit the Earth, or whatever, every couple of weeks it's something like that.
Right.
Planet X
Right.
is going to collide into the sun or something. So somebody says something like that, and there are Christians that will be just waiting for that day for it to come to pass, so they can get online and blast this guy. But yeah, you don't really see that in anywhere else. I'm not sure if that's necessarily a good thing or a bad thing, but it's an interesting difference.
It's good that we hold each other accountable, but we've kind of got a reputation of eating our own.
Yeah.
And that's kind of unfortunate, because Jesus said we would be known by our love for each other. It doesn't necessarily seem to be the case a lot of times.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. It's kind of hard to deal with sometimes, but and that going back to the CERN thing, that actually kind of what I was gonna say, that kind of adds to that as well. That I'm currently working on a book about CERN, and I don't think I've really officially announced that, so I guess I'm doing that now. But part of what I wanted to do was I had, when I was looking at all my research and when I form an opinion of my own, I try to look at all sides, or if there's two opposing sides, I try to really look at both and see which I'm gonna. But with this, I really couldn't pick a side, and it was because the two main sides of this whole CERN thing are either it's just a scientific endeavor, and the LHC isn't doing anything that nature isn't doing already, and all that. There's that side of it, and then there's the other side where it's no, this is evil. It's not a good thing. We shouldn't be messing around with this stuff. We don't know what we're getting into. And there's that side, and I understand both sides. I guess I personally lean more to the, we probably shouldn't be messing with some of this stuff that we don't have any understanding of, because we just don't know. But the way that I'm constructing the book is exploring both sides, because I am fascinated with the science too. But so I can agree with what you said about how you don't want to demonize all of the scientists that are doing it. I agree with you. I don't believe that all of them are necessarily in it for the type. Yeah, yeah, exactly. But yeah, at the same time, it's something to be cautious about. And I actually part of my research is it's not ending with the LHC at CERN. There's going to be more. They're in talks about something called the ILC, or International Linear Collider, and I looked up what they have posted what the three main goals of this thing is going to be, and a couple of them are I guess okay, but one of them's it's interesting. So the first two, it's measure the mass, spin, and interaction strength of the Higgs boson. Okay, that's not too bad. Investigate the lightest supersymmetric particles, which are candidates for dark matter. Okay, I understand that. But then there's discover if electron volt scale extra dimensions exist, and if so, measure their number, size, and shape. And I thought that was kind of interesting how that was thrown in there, because the first two are kind of like, okay, that kind of makes sense, and then there's this one that's like way out there in left field, but I guess that's one of the things that they're going to try to do. So I wonder, I often wonder if they get to the point where they not only can prove that extra dimensions exist, but also measure their number, size, and shape. Because right now it's all theoretical. It's just the math that's saying it. There's no experimentations really. But if they're able to do that, the process is to try to use gravitons, which theoretically are the only particle that can naturally traverse dimensions. And the gravitons hasn't been actually observed yet. So that to me that seems like where they say we are in scientific achievements and stuff. That's a pretty ambitious thing to claim to be able to do. But I don't know. I mean, maybe they are further along than they report sometimes.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I'm interested in, you got the science of the really small on that end, and then you have the science of the really big, which is astrophysics. And it's funny how they're both talking about the same sorts of things nowadays. But they really haven't resolved they haven't resolved the mathematics between, particle theory and just general relativity and things like that. The math doesn't really work yet, so they're still working on that. But they are talking about the same sorts of things. One of the ways they're trying to put it together is this brain world idea, where there are all these parallel universes. I would never subscribe to something as absurd as like the many world theory, which is basically like every time there's a decision that a whole universe breaks off. I mean, that just gets to be ridiculous.
Yeah.
It's absolutely absurd. But something like brain world theory, I think might have a lot of explanatory power and be close to what's really going on. And this is the idea that there are some parallel universes, not an unlimited number, but some, and there's a larger reality, and they call that the bulk, and then there are these membranes, and a membrane would be like, just think of a sheet hanging on a clothesline, and then a parallel clothesline to it, a foot away, with another sheet on it. Well, both sheets are universes, so, and so that would be a four-dimensional space-time sheet, and then another four-dimensional space-time sheet, and then the larger reality is called the bulk. Well, if those two sheets were to touch each other, that would be a wormhole, between the two universes. This is the way I've heard it described by Paul Steinhardt up at Princeton. And it's, I think, one of his pet theories, brain world theory. And that kind of seems like it could be, something that has some truth to it. And the idea, like you're talking about, they think gravitons would be the way to communicate between the universes. Well, I think that's kind of born out of what they're trying to figure out what dark matter is.
Yeah.
They discovered that they only understand about 3% of the entire universe now.
Yeah.
They literally, which I think is just an awesome quote. We've discovered that there's all this matter out there and we don't know what it is. So the periodic table and chemistry and physics and all the stuff that science is so authoritative about, explaining everything, and they don't need God anymore because we've got it all figured out, but actually we don't understand 97% of the universe. It's almost absurd. To admit that on one hand and yet be so overconfident on the other hand. But they're saying that they don't know what dark matter is, and it makes up the majority of what they detect out there. They see all this mass. They have all this gravity they can't explain. That's really what it is. That's what dark matter is they detect gravity, and they don't know where it is. So one of the leading theories is that it's in a parallel universe, a parallel brain world that I'm talking about. The sheet that's laying next to us, that's hanging next to us on the clothesline, has a lot of mass. Now, we can feel the gravity, but the light from that universe is trapped within that four-dimensional space-time, so we cannot see it.
Yeah.
So we detect the gravitons, but we don't see anything, and that's why it's dark matter. So that's how brain world theory would explain dark matter, and that's why gravitons might be the means we could actually even communicate between these universes. If you could start to send gravitons, like we ever could actually put a graviton in a jar or something, you could use those to send ones and zeros or something like that maybe, and actually talk to the other universe or something like that. They're actually, parsing those kind of ideas around now, and that's why, gravity would be the force that would be the one that could go between. Now, in the science of the very big, I'm talking about this idea of portals, dimensional gates and whatnot in the book. Based on the latest evidence, our galaxy, the Milky Way galaxy, could be a huge wormhole. There's a theory out right now that all spiral galaxies are wormholes, and if it's true, that it's probably stable and navigable, meaning, you could live through a journey through it. So astrophysicists, they're combining general relativity, and then they're looking at the distribution of dark matter that they see in the Milky Way, and it really looks like the whole thing might be a big wormhole. And so there's articles on the internet right now. You can find one at Science News, and the title is, "In theory, the Milky Way could be a, quote, galactic transport system," end quote. So, the idea that we're talking about, that there's portals to parallel worlds, to other realms, you could call it heaven, you could call it the netherworld, you could call it hell. I think it's hell, but maybe Sheol would be this other universe, or Hades. But, there are other realms. Science seems to support this idea now, and that there are potentially a galactic transport system that will take you there and back. Now, you start reading that, start hearing New Agers talking about vortex energy. You see these ancient Americans drawing spiral petroglyphs with entities coming out of the spiral. And then you combine that with God speaking out of a whirlwind to Job. Elijah going up to heaven through a whirlwind. What's a whirlwind? It's a vortex. Okay, this all starts to come together in some interesting ways. It makes a lot of sense that maybe that was actually a real thing. When you look at black holes classically, they would think that a black hole would just completely destroy you before you even got near the event horizon, because the gravitational forces would just rip you to shreds. Well, a scientist named Roy Carr came up with the idea of spinning black holes, and it turns out they do spin. They've observed the accretion disk, and it seems to show that it is spinning. But if they spin at the precise right rate, the inertia will cancel out the gravitational effects, making it navigable, meaning you could live through, going through the event horizon. So there are ways that black holes could be used in a way that wouldn't kill you. You could go through it. And interestingly, this is the vortex, a spinning hole. Now, I mentioned Job, I mentioned Elijah, they've been taken up through a whirlwind. But then think about the near-death experience literature. People, what do they say? Oh, I went through a tunnel.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, what's that? Okay. How come everybody, that's one of the most common elements of the near-death experience. They went through a tunnel. And so now we're in the realm of the immaterial now. We're in this realm of consciousness. But these people are still have memories. They see physical things. There's a veridical part to these experiences that tells me they're real. So I don't know that there's something real about this tunnel too, probably. I don't know to what extent it's physical, what extent it's immaterial. I don't really know how that works yet, but there's something to it. You look at the classical paintings from the Middle Ages, this big spinning vortex with thousands of angels going through it. Do you know that painting I'm talking about?
Yeah.
It's on. It's a famous painting. It's hundreds of years old, and it's a big wormhole full of angels, basically. And these ideas go way back. But science supports that that's the way it might look. I think that's probably not just an accident.
Yeah, absolutely. I've seen that. I think I've seen that connected with Dr. Michael Heiser's work on the Divine Council. I think that was the first time that I
he has that photo. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. Yep.
Yeah.
There you go. That looks like what we would call, a wormhole, basically. It's the same thing that it seems to be ubiquitous throughout the spiritual literature. So I don't think it's an accident that science is saying that's the way it would work as well.
Yeah, I agree. It's absolutely fascinating. Where do you believe all this might fit in with Bible prophecy, and what do you think the next few years or so are going to look like?
Well, of course, that's really the trajectory that we go out in the book. We are believers in Bible prophecy. Tom and I both do think that the return of Christ and the tribulation and all those events could possibly happen in our lifetimes. We do want to warn people and wake people up to that reality. We don't set dates. So we don't claim to know with any authority when exactly that's going to happen. We just think it could be soon, and people should be paying attention. So we'd like to propose ways that it might go down, and and you can be the judge yourself, whether we're handling it right or not. But I think we're obviously sincere, and we believe what we're saying, and we try to tell the truth to the best of our ability. And we're not always right, but that's kind of the genre that we're writing in is prophecy and looking at how this might play out. Well, the Bible, several places, has things that sound like these same type of portal areas. Now, I mentioned the Bradshaw Ranch where I went in Sedona. I mentioned that Linda Ball she'd seen Bigfoot. She'd seen flying saucers. She saw orbs. She saw strange creatures. And this is ubiquitous throughout the literature. The Skinwalker Ranch. A lot of people have probably heard of that from coast to coast. People see UFOs. People see Bigfoot. People see weird creatures. This is the same story is associated with all these famous areas. Point Pleasant, West Virginia, when John Keel, the author of the Mothman prophecies, for like a 2-year period, there was an increase in UFO sightings. A giant thunderbird, which is like a pterodactyl type, huge flying dinosaur type thing, flying over the area. People witnessing that. People witnessing the Mothman, the really weird winged guy flying around. So all these weird creatures, same story, a portal opens up. So, I think that there's plenty of examples of that. Now, in Scripture, in Isaiah chapter 13, it's talking about the destruction of Babylon. And this is where we get a little controversy we have some differences between the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament, which is done around between 300 BC and 100 AD. The prophets, probably Isaiah, I suspect, was translated around 100 BC or somewhere in that area, probably before Jesus ever walked on the earth, because that was one of the major prophetic books. I suspect they got to it right after the Torah. So you're looking at a Greek translation that talks about the gates opening and God sending giants to fulfill his wrath. Literally talking about, it says, "Open you gates, you rulers, giants are coming to fulfill my wrath." He's talking about what sounds to me like the Nephilim from the Old Testament coming in judgment in the end times, to basically reap destruction on the earth.
Yeah.
Similar to these scorpion-tailed things that fly out of the bottomless pit at the fifth trumpet judgment. So, the Bible speaks of weird doors opening to other realms and weird creatures pouring out in droves, basically to put in judgment on mankind. But it says, those who have the seal of God on their foreheads are protected. So that tells me there are going to be some believers that weren't raptured that are still here, right?
Yeah.
I don't know how that plays into the whole pre-trib rapture debate, but it says don't harm those with the seal of God on their foreheads. Now, you can parse out how you want. I'm not going to get into the rapture discussion, but the idea is that, I don't think it's an accident that the New Agers and the UFO people are talking about seeing strange beings, UFOs, in these portal areas than we see in the Bible. In Isaiah 13, giants are coming through. It says, then, after all this stuff happens, after the judgment of Babylon, that devils and satyrs, which are half goat, half human, genetic monstrosities, basically, like the god Pan, it says satyrs will dwell there in Babylon. The Bible talks about this like it's a reality, like it's going to happen. So we have these weird hybrid creatures. We have devils there. This is all in Isaiah 13. So you see the same sort of thing happening in the end times. Portal opens, but all these weird creatures come through, but it's not going to be pretty. So we believe that this is one of the concept calls it one of the most neglected aspects of Bible prophecy. And I think he might be right about that because very few people talk about it. But, we have the bottomless pit opening in Revelation. We have angels coming out of the river Euphrates in Revelation. In Isaiah 13, the day of the Lord, we see open the gates, the giants come through, all these weird creatures come through. So, we suspect that the tribulation is going to be marked by a period of weirdness that the world has never seen. And this is what Jesus said. He said there will be a time, a tribulation that's so great, it's greater than anything the world has ever seen or ever will be, ever happen again. And this is one of the best arguments, against preterism. The idea that everything in Matthew 24 happened in AD 70 with the Romans sacking Jerusalem. Jesus said that this will be at the time that it'll never be preceded in history. Now, I have a hard time saying that the Romans' destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70 was more serious than Nagasaki and Hiroshima being wiped out by atomic weapons in World War II, or 6 million Jews being slaughtered in the Holocaust.
Yeah.
I don't think that AD 70 rises to the occasion that Jesus was talking about when he said there will be a time, that will never be bested in history. I don't think that's happened yet. I think he's talking about something much bigger than we've ever seen and much scarier than people have ever seen. Yeah, for that reason, I do hope the rapture happens beforehand, but I'm not counting on it.
Yeah, that's a good stance to take, and that's the same that I take. I am pre-trib, but I don't know really why I am. I just am. But I always kind of
wishful thinking.
It might be because honestly, like if I wanted to, I think I would have an easier time defending pre-wrath. But I don't know. I just don't. But
I went over to the pre-wrath side myself. I think Chris White convinced me with.
Yeah.
Of that one, yeah.
Yeah. He brings up some things that I'll admit are hard to have an answer for.
The thing that really got me with that mainly was I did my exegetical research paper for my hermeneutics class in seminary on 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. And verse 3 of that chapter says, "For that day will not come unless the apostasy happens first and the man of lawlessness is revealed."
Right.
Okay. And Paul is writing. He's writing to a Christian church. And he's telling them, no, the day of the Lord you didn't miss the day of the Lord because the apostasy hasn't happened and you haven't even seen the Antichrist yet.
Right.
So that tells me that those things have to happen. That we would see them, right? So that seems to be his message. Now, some people have come along and tried to say that the word apostasia in Greek means departure. And so that Paul was actually saying that day won't come until the rapture happens, and then the man of lawlessness is revealed. That's not true, though, because it means apostasy. It means falling away. And I traced the use of apostasia in the Septuagint. I just took my Logos Bible software, and I searched for apostasia throughout the Septuagint, and I read every usage in the Old Testament of that Greek term, and it never means a physical departure. If you were going to translate departure, it would be like departure from faith or departure from sound doctrine. It means apostasy. So it's not talking about the rapture. It seems to me Paul is warning that church that you're going to see a falling away and you're going to see the revealing of the Antichrist before the day of the Lord. So, but you haven't missed it. So I suspect that we will see those things when they happen.
Yeah, and I can confirm that too. Not that you need confirmation, but I can confirm that too about the apostasy thing. Because I've done similar research. I think it was for my first book. I went through this long period of about a year, and this was a few years ago, of where I cycled through each of the 3 or 4 rapture beliefs.
Okay.
There was a time that I believed in each and every one of them, and I started off pre, and then I think I went to post for a little while, and then mid, and then I discovered pre-wrath was a thing, so I was that for a while, and I cycled. Yeah, I cycled through all these different things, but that was one of the things that in my research came up too, is that absolutely does mean apostasy of the church, and it's important to know that because that's something that we should be looking out for.
I think we're seeing it too. I think we're seeing it right now in the West anyway. I mean, this whole idea, you have all the major mainline denominations are now ordaining homosexual clergy and putting them in front of their congregations. Now, I heard John Piper say this, so it's not just me being hard. Piper is like, you're putting people in front of your congregation who are modeling a lifestyle that the Bible says leads to hell.
Yeah.
Okay, that's what they're doing. And now, if that's not apostasy, what is?
Yeah.
I mean, the leaders that are modeling, Christian life for the congregation are going to hell.
Yeah.
So what kind of model is that? That's not a model, obviously. So that's apostasy, and that's just, gosh, it's getting so widespread now. It's just crazy. And of course, I would say Roman Catholicism probably apostatized, institutionally a long time ago. So
Absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that. And man, I want to continue this conversation, but I know you said you were limited on time, so I don't want to keep you any longer.
Okay.
But if people want to know more about you or your work, pick up your book, where can they go?
Well, of course, Tom Horn's site is survivalmall.com, and he always runs all kinds of specials. I don't think there's any special on the book anymore. I think it ran out. But, of course, Amazon.com has On the Path of the Immortals available. And I have my websites are logosapologia.org. Maybe you can put links to these in the show notes or something, and supernaturalworldview.com. And I do have a limited number of On the Path of the Immortals that I'm going to sign and sell, basically at the same price as Amazon charges for them. And through my Amazon store, it's Cris Putnam's Supernatural Worldview store. That's linked at my websites. And right now, Amazon's not allowing me to list that book because I think it's so new that they have a waiting period before other people can list it. But I'm gonna be offering it, signed copies of it fairly shortly. And I'll do that through those two websites.
Okay. All right. Good deal. And so people should check that out. And I want to give you the opportunity, if you could wrap up this entire show in one last thought that you would want the audience to leave with, what would that be?
Well, one of the things that we dealt with in On the Path of the Immortals is I looked at this, world grid idea. There was a ufologist named Ivan Sanderson who came up with these things called the Vortexes, and it was the Bermuda Triangle, the Devil's Sea. He had a whole thing of 10 of them, and this idea that there's a grid around the world. Well, when you start parsing that, people come up with what is the central point? What is the point of the world grid? They call it the axis mundi, or the navel of the world, or all these ideas like that. What is the center of the world? Well, in that chapter, we used that idea, what is your axis mundi, as a means of making an evangelistic appeal. And, if I was going to put a cap on everything and summarize it all in that, is that, what's really driving us and what's driving our passion behind this work is that Jesus Christ is our axis mundi. He really is the center of the universe. He really is the navel of the world, and that everything centers on Christ. And we believe that, and we believe that, your eternal destiny is wrapped up in your decision about who Jesus Christ is. Is he Lord? Is he God? Did he die for your sins? Did he resurrect on the third day to prove who he was? We firmly affirm those things and believe them. And, we hope that, some of the readers might come to this book from a secular worldview and become convinced that, he did those things and he was who he said he was, and he really is the axis mundi of the world. So that's how I want to close. It's just that, I hope that your listeners have a firm grasp of what we call the good news, or the gospel, and that's that Jesus Christ did die for our sins, and that there's nothing we can do to earn God's favor. There's no laws we can keep. There's no works we can do that merit our salvation, that only his sacrificial atoning death on the cross merits our own righteousness. We have no righteousness in and of ourselves, but then when we believe in him and his resurrection, his righteousness is applied to us, and God looks at us and sees Christ. And for that means we're able to enter heaven and be in the presence of a holy God. And I just hope that the listeners all understand that and believe that. And if they don't, that they would find out some more about that.
Well, thank you so much. I couldn't have said that better myself. That's beautifully said, and that's my personal. That's my biggest prayer for for your ministry and your books is that message gets out, and then also once people do come to Christ, that they can be prepared for what's ahead. So I really appreciate you coming on the show. You're doing really important work, and I just want to thank you so much. And we're gonna have to do this again sometime.
All right, thanks a lot, Josh.
Yep. All right. Again, that was Cris Putnam, co-author of On the Path of the Immortals, alongside Tom Horn. I definitely recommend Chris's work because not only is it meticulously researched, but also because it'll help you explore some new possibilities that might fit better than what you've been traditionally taught. If you would like to find more episodes of The Sharpening, you can do so at ministudyministry.com, and also my YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/Josh Peck Disclosure. Also, if you care to help support Mini Study Ministry, you can do so at ministudyministry.com. Your donations go to the everyday running of Mini Study Ministry and help bring you more episodes of The Sharpening, as well as books and other materials. And as I say in every episode, I'll say again, please only donate if you feel God leading you to do so. If you're not sure, or if you don't feel led, you can always pray for us. A lot of times that's more effective anyway. We can always use more prayer. We're not 501c3, so your donations aren't tax deductible. Not that we're against that. We're just not. So, and I'll never be the kind of person that's gonna promise you extra blessings from God or miraculous tenfold return on your money or anything like that. We're not in the business of making promises for God. But what I can promise is that your help, be it prayer or financial, whatever it is, it's greatly appreciated. It keeps us going, and is the only reason we're able to continue doing what we do. So, all of that being said, this is The Sharpening, and I am your host, Josh Peck. As always, take care, and God bless.